Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. Today I'm sharing a beginner-friendly tutorial. I'm going to be walking you through my painting process for these simple one-layer watercolor pumpkin illustrations, which are just perfect for the fall season. For those of you just getting started with watercolor, these will provide great practice for you to continue developing your water and your brush control, both of which are skills that definitely are super essential to have when painting with watercolor. And for those of you who are a little bit farther ahead, these are awesome watercolor illustrations that you can add into greeting cards and also larger pieces to frame and give away during this fall season. I will be walking you through everything from how I create my freehand preliminary pencil sketches to how I choose and prepare my different color mixtures to how I actually go ahead and paint these pumpkins with just one layer. As you can see, I've prepared 5 different pumpkins to share, all with different colors and different shapes so that we can practice these different things as we have fun with these illustrations. So without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight in. All right, so the very first thing that you're gonna be seeing me do is I'm gonna work on my preliminary pencil sketches for these 5 pumpkins before going ahead and painting them. And as I've shared in past tutorials in which I also include my sketching process, I always use an HB drawing pencil and I make sure to sketch these very, very lightly because I don't really want to damage my paper. I want to be able to erase mistakes as I go, and I also don't want to be able to see my pencil work through my transparent paint at the end. Now, another thing that I've shared in past sketching tutorials is that I always like working from a general largest shape, and I make my way towards smaller shapes and details. So with all of these, you've probably already noticed that I start by laying down what I like to call an envelope. An envelope is just a very basic, blocky, geometric-y shape that I imagine around the subject or the object that I am going to be developing and drawing. In other words, I imagine that object or that subject being wrapped with wrapping paper, so the outer silhouette, so to speak, but I'm not even worrying about laying down any perfect curves or anything like that. I just imagine a big, blocky shape. So I just visualize the initial general shape, and then once I have that initial shape correct, or that envelope, I then divide or separate that larger blocky shape into medium-sized shapes, which in the case of these pumpkins, pumpkins have different curved sections to them. So that's what I'm visualizing after having laid down that preliminary blocky envelope shape. Another thing that I also make sure to do before dividing out or sectioning out that larger shape into smaller or medium-sized shapes is I decide where the central top part of the pumpkin is going to be so that I can place the stem in the correct location, because this is gonna do wonders for actually making this look like a 3D form and like it's actually being seen at a specific perspective because you're able to see that top part of the pumpkin. I am drawing this from imagination, but I did take time to look at a bunch of different pumpkin photos to get ideas in terms of different shapes and colors that I could use for these illustrations. And this is something that I would highly, highly recommend you do as well if you're having trouble visualizing your pumpkins, and also whenever you want to create any mid to higher levels of realism in your work, support yourself with using references. Make sure that you are capturing the main things that pumpkins show in real life. Because pumpkins are organic, natural objects, I also make sure to capture a lot of irregularity and imperfection throughout them. All right, so here are my 5 finished pencil sketches. I am going to be moving on to the painting process. So for these illustrations, I'm only going to be using 2 round brushes in sizes 4 and 2. I'm going to be painting the majority of these pumpkins with my size 4 round brush, and the only thing that I'm going to be painting with my size 2 round brush is the stem. I also want to make sure to mention that I change my water after finishing with every pumpkin. I always want to start out with clean, fresh water. Okay, so let's get started with the first pumpkin, which is gonna be the basic orange pumpkin. For all of these, I'm gonna be using colors from my St. Petersburg White Nights full pan paint set. You by no means have to use the exact same colors that I am going to be using. I'm gonna be swatching all of these out for you before getting started with my painting process, so just go ahead and use what you have that's most similar. For this first orange pumpkin, I'm going to be using my cadmium lemon, my golden deep, which is that second orange color that I swatched out, and my burnt sienna. These 3 colors are going to help me create a variety of orangish hues and also values throughout that pumpkin, which is going to help me arrive at a nice, at least somewhat 3D believable look, even with just 1 layer of paint. Even when I am working on looser, more expressive 1-layer illustrations like what I am doing today, I make sure to set myself up for success by preparing myself different colors or color mixtures that will enable me to create a wide variety of different hues and values so that I can create a nice sensation of light and shadow and stay away from flatness. Always remember that it's via the development of different values, meaning lights, a wide range of midtones, and darkest darks, that you're able to give something a sense of 3D form and depth. And if you don't give thought to the objects or the subjects' 3-dimensional structure and how you're going to be developing this wide variety of different values and a sensation of light and shadow, then most likely than not, there is going to be flatness in your paintings and illustrations. And that's perfectly okay if you're going for that style. But if you're going for mid to higher levels of realism, then it is very, very important that you give thought to how you're going to be developing these different hues and values. Okay, so having explained all of that fundamental information to understand for success, I am now going to move on to explain my painting process for you guys. And this is the same method that I'm going to be using for all of these pumpkins. Of course, I am going to be using different color combinations for each. But essentially, I prepared, in this case, 3 colors on my color mixing palette. The first one at the top is a very, very light orange. It's almost all yellow with just a little bit of that orange in it. And then I prepared an orange in that second well on my way down. And then the third well is just pure burnt sienna. So I have 3 different colors. And I know that with these 3, I'm going to be able to develop a wide variety of different values. So with my nice juicy color mixtures prepared on my color mixing palette, and with juicy color mixtures, I mean I have around 50% water, 50% paint in those color mixtures. They're nice and juicy. They have a good amount of color in them, but also plenty of water going on there so that I can load up those paintbrush bristles and go in nice and quick with a good amount of paint and water in my bristles so that I can paint in that shape quickly. If your color mixtures are way too dry or you are using a paintbrush that is way too small, you're not going to be able to paint quickly. And in order to create this kind of looser painting, you need to prepare a nice, juicy, well-pigmented color mixture, and you need to be able to load up your paintbrush with a good amount of paint so that you can move quickly and not have to reload again and again and again, because every single time you reload your paintbrush, your paint is already starting to dry and you're going to be left with sharp defined edges around the shapes that you're painting in, and you don't want that. Okay, so once my color mixtures were prepared on my color mixing palette, I loaded up my paintbrush with a good amount of that first lightest color or color mixture that I prepared for this pumpkin, which is in this case the color mixture at the top, the lightest one, which is that yellow or that very, very light orange. And I'm always going to be making my way from my lightest color that I've prepared for myself towards the darkest color. The way that I'm approaching all of these pumpkins is I am painting them section by section. So what I am doing all throughout this pumpkin is initially I am going in to paint that first lightest layer with my yellow or my very, very light orange. And then while that initial layer of lightest color is still wet, I am dropping in my second color, which is my orange, in the sections of darker midtones that I want to darken. And because I'm dropping in that orange on a layer of paint that is still wet, that orange is going to blur out, bleed out, and dissipate, expand into that layer of paint that is still wet, right? And then after I finished up with my second color, I'm gonna drop in the darkest color only in sections of darkest darks that I wanna darken sections in even more. And as I am adding in all of these colors, because I am working quickly on paint that is still wet, I'm getting all of these beautiful wet on wet effects in which the paint is expanding and creating nice soft gradients into the previous color. What's essential here is that you only want to push darker values in sections where you're actually visualizing midtones or darkest darks to be in. Because at the end, you want to make sure that you have sections in which you're only able to see the lightest color, the yellowish or the light orange. And then you want to have other sections in which you're able to see the orange. And you want to have other sections in which you're able to see the burnt sienna. You don't want to start losing control and start dropping in too much of a darker color and then have that expand and cover up all of the previous lighter colors. And you also do not want to go in and start just mindlessly merging all of the colors together, because you're also going to be creating just one flat color by merging all of them together. Place your color confidently and leave it be. Again, it all comes down to developing a wide range of hues and values. As I move along working on these different sections throughout the pumpkin, you can probably see how I'm leaving little sections in which I have a sliver of white paper showing through that I left unpainted. And this is something that I am doing intentionally so that I can move quickly through this one layer illustration and have at least a little bit of that paper dividing those different curved sections. If I didn't leave those little sections of white paper shining through, all of this paint would start merging together and I would just create a shape with a bunch of different colors throughout it, and it wouldn't look much like a pumpkin. So make sure that you leave at least certain sections of that white paper shining through. It doesn't have to be a white line going down all the way from top to bottom. As long as you leave certain sections, you'll create that division between these curved sections throughout the pumpkin. But make sure that you're leaving somewhat of a little line or sliver of paper shining through. You're also going to notice that in all of these pumpkins, I leave little abstract shapes of white paper shining through that I just leave unpainted. These are shapes that I didn't really plan for. They just happen organically and naturally as I am quickly painting in these separate shapes throughout the pumpkin, and I just embrace them as highlights. When we're painting with watercolor, it's important to incorporate that whiteness of the paper, because the whiteness of the paper stands in place for our highlights. All right, so right here I am pretty much done with the orange sections, and I am going to quickly change to my size 2 round brush to paint in the stem. And for the stem, I'm going to be using 2 different browns, a lighter brown and a darker brown. My lighter brown is raw sienna, and my darker brown is burnt umber. And essentially I'm doing the exact same thing that I did for the body of the pumpkin. I am first going to use my lighter color of the two, and then I am going to go in with the darker color. And if you want that merging, that blurring out to happen, that wet on wet to happen, then you have to make sure to drop in your darker color while that initial lighter color is still wet. When I am painting in wood or stems, I like using shorter brush strokes, and I like curving them in different ways, just taking into account the 3D structure of that stem and keeping little teeny tiny sections of white paper shining through, because this helps me describe that, that wood texture for the stem. Even with the stem, I am trying to develop a wide range of values in this very small area. You can see sections of little teeny tiny highlights. You can see sections of light translucent browns, and you can see sections of darker browns. All right, so we're gonna be moving on to our second pumpkin, and this one is going to be the blue pumpkin. We're also going to be dropping in a little bit of violet. So to begin, I am preparing a grayed out blue that I created by mixing together Indian Throne Blue and Burnt Umber. Burnt Umber, because it's a dark brown, it's going to mute out that very bright Indian Throne Blue. And it makes it a lot more desaturated, a lot more realistic looking, more similar to the blues that I've seen in blue pumpkins, which are slightly more grayed out. And I'm swatching these out for you right here so that you can see that kind of grayish blue that I arrive at by mixing together my Indian Throne Blue with my Burnt Umber. You can play around with your color ratios as long as your blue isn't super bright and it's slightly desaturated. You're good to go. And aside from that grayed out blue color mixture, I'm also going to be preparing an Indian Throne Blue plus water mixture and an ultramarine violet plus water color mixture so that I can drop those in to develop my nice variety of hues and values in each section. All right, so with my color mixtures ready, I loaded up my brush with a good amount of that grayed out blue color mixture, which is the lightest color that I'm going to be going in with initially. And because this is a relatively dark color, I make extra sure that I'm going in with my grayed out blue in a very translucent state. What does this mean? It means that it's pretty watery. You can even test out your color mixture on a scrap piece of watercolor paper to make sure that you're going in nice and translucent. And if it is too saturated, then just add a few drops of water into your mixture, mix it well, and then test it out on your scrap piece of watercolor paper once again, just to make sure that you're going in nice and translucent. If you go in very dark and saturated right off the bat, you're gonna have nowhere to build towards because your darkest values are already gonna be there. So by starting out with lighter values and working inside of those lighter value areas, dropping in more color and darkening areas within that, you're going to be able to develop more of a 3D believable structure. And then with that initial lightest layer still wet, you're going to drop in a bit of that Indian Throne Blue plus water color mixture in certain sections. And also you can drop in a little bit of that ultramarine violet in certain sections, just to add a little bit more of a variety in hues and some interest into some sections. Throughout this entire painting process, I am constantly helping myself with my absorbent towel, which I have right below me right there. You can see it on screen. I am gently tapping the tip of my paintbrush on it to remove the excess water and paint. And I'm also along the way constantly using both my absorbent towel and the clean bristles of my paintbrush to do absorbing of excess water and paint as I am moving along painting in these small shapes. It's very easy to lose control, start dropping in way too much water or paint into these very small shapes. So continue helping yourself with your absorbent towel and the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush, use them as a little absorbent sponge. Also, if you go in with way too much paint and things start looking way too flat, go in and pick up some of that excess paint and create those lighter values in certain sections, add transparency into certain sections by doing some lifting while that paint is still wet. That will help you add dimension back into areas that you have perhaps made too heavy or have flattened out way too much with way too much saturated color. I'm always keeping an eye on how many different values I've already developed in each section that I am working on. And if I find that I go in with way too much saturated color way too quickly, I make sure to remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with just a little bit of water in my paintbrush and expand that color that I've already placed into the larger shape so that this will make that color a lot more transparent and subtle because I'm expanding it. I'm using that same amount of color that I've already placed to cover up a larger area. I want to provide a tip for those of you who are finding that your paint is drying way too quickly and you're not able to create those beautiful wet on wet gradients and effects. Here is a little tip for you because I myself live in a very warm, very dry environment and I have to have the fan on top of me or I am going to die sweating. And so a little tip for you is that when you're painting in that initial lightest layer of paint, go over the entire section 2 to 3 times so that you can make sure that that little shape stays nice and wet for a little bit longer before you start dropping in your second or your third colors. As I do this wetting, I make sure to work around the little sections of highlights that I originally created. This tip applies if A, you're sure that your color mixtures are nice and juicy, and B, you're going in with a good size of paintbrush for the area on hand. None of that super small, tiny paintbrush nonsense if you're gonna be painting in a larger or even medium-sized shape. Because again, you're gonna find yourself reloading your paintbrush again and again, and by the time you come back in, that initial shape is gonna start to dry and you're gonna be left with harsh, defined edges around the shapes that you're painting in. And most likely than not, you're gonna wanna go in and kind of fix those textures that you created by accident, and that is going to lead to an overworked, splotchy mess. The quality and the thickness and even how textured your paper is also going to have an impact on how quickly it absorbs that water and that paint and how it settles on it. So there are a bunch of different variables that could be affecting both the process, how quickly your paint is drying, and also, of course, the outcome. All right, so I finished up with the body of this grayish blue pumpkin. Hopefully you can see how all throughout these different sections of the pumpkin, I have very light translucent areas with that grayish blue. I have a wide variety of midtones and I have darkest dark areas and I have little pops of violet color. I also left some highlights throughout. And the way that I painted the stem is exactly the same way that I approached painting the first stem. I went in initially with the raw sienna and then I went in with the burnt umber with those shorter, upwards and slightly curved brush strokes. All right, it's time to move on to the green pumpkin. And the 3 colors that I'm gonna be using for this one are my cadmium lemon, once again, bringing it back. And then I'm going to be using my olive green and my indigo, which is a very dark, deep, rich blue that I'm going to be adding to my olive green to create a darker green. So you can see my little puddle of my cadmium lemon, which I'm going to be adding a tiny bit of my olive green into so that I can create a light green. And then I have a puddle of olive green with just water in it. And at the very bottom, I have a mixture of olive green plus a tiny bit of indigo. So I'm about ready to get started. I'm going to be swatching out these colors for you on the scrap piece of watercolor paper that I have on hand. This is my darkest green, my olive green plus indigo. This is my medium green, which is just plain olive green. And this is my plain cadmium lemon that I'm going to be adding a tiny bit of that olive green into just to get it more towards the lighter green side. All right, we're ready to get started. So the process is exactly the same as what we've been doing. I'm approaching this in sections and I am going in initially with a nice paintbrush load and painting in that first lightest color. And I'm running my paintbrush bristles over this entire shape a couple of times to ensure that it's still wet, by the time that I drop in my second color. And I am making sure to drop in that second color and also the third darkest color in sections where it would make sense according to the 3D little structure of this pumpkin. All right, you guys, we're all done with this green pumpkin and we are now moving on to the white one. And for this one, I really just used two colors. Initially, I was going to use the orange again, just drop in some orange into certain sections. But then I decided against it because I've definitely seen just plain white pumpkins out there and I like the way that it looked. So I'm really only going to be using my ultramarine blue plus my burnt sienna to create a gray. Make sure that you take your time combining your ultramarine blue with your burnt sienna, or you could even use a burnt umber, whatever dark brown you have. Until you arrive at a gray. If you have more blue than brown in your color mixture, it's gonna look like a dark blue. And if you have more brown than blue in your color mixture, it's gonna look like a dark brown. I myself wanted to use a slightly warmer gray to paint this white pumpkin. So all this means is I have a little tiny bit more brown than blue in my gray color mixture, which makes it look warmer. The burnt sienna definitely helps because it's a reddish brown. If you're using a darker brown, then it might not look as warm as mine. However, if you want your gray to be slightly cooler, then you can feel free to add in a tiny bit more blue than brown in your color mixture so that you can have that cooler temperature to it. Or if you want something completely in between, then just make sure to have like a 50-50 amount of each and test it out on your scrap piece of watercolor paper until you arrive at a gray that you want. All right, so these last two pumpkins are gonna provide great practice for us because they are either white or a very, very light gray. And if you've ever tried to paint white objects with watercolor, or even like white animals or animals with white fur, white feathers, that kind of thing, then you probably already know that it can be tricky because we're using the whiteness of the paper under the paint to stand in place not only for our highlights, but also to help us communicate the fact that this object or this animal or whatever it is white. So what this means is that we have to go in very pale, very translucent with our color and make sure that we're leaving even larger portions of that paper shining through, and that we're dropping in just a bit of color at a time to develop a variety of values in this pumpkin. Even though we're painting something that's white, we definitely need to develop somewhat of a variety of different values throughout it, because otherwise it's going to look very flat. It's not going to look very believable, right? We're not going to be able to develop any sensation of 3D form to any degree if we don't have any amount of values developed throughout it. So we definitely do want to go in with some amount of paint. However, in these cases, I am being even more mindful in order to make sure that I'm going in super, super pale and translucent, that I am not dropping in way too much paint, and you can see me do plenty of lifting whenever I feel that I have darkened sections a little bit too much. Make sure that you are going in with just a small amount of paint at a time, and continue helping yourself along the way, both with your bristles of your paintbrush. Use those clean bristles as a little absorbent sponge when you feel you've dropped in way too much paint or water, and also continue helping yourself with your absorbent towel. I start by placing my translucent gray in darker value areas, and once I feel I have enough color on my paper, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in just with a tiny bit of water in my paintbrush and I pull that color into lighter value areas. And then if I still feel that I've darkened sections way too much, I do some lifting. And conversely to that, if I want to darken certain sections a little bit more, while that initial layer is still wet, I drop in a little bit more of that gray in darker value areas, but I make sure to just drop in a tiny bit of paint. And you've already seen me do plenty of scrubbing as well. This is a technique that you want to do very gently, only when truly required, because you can definitely damage your paper and make everything look very overworked if you go in and do way too much scrubbing. Scrubbing is basically when you go in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and you do gentle running over sections that you want to lift or edges that you want to soften. Do remember that watercolor tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So it might be that you think that something looks a little bit too dark, or that the entire pumpkin looks too gray, or that you haven't left enough highlights. And then later on, once everything is dry, it looks pretty good. The more you continue practicing painting with watercolor, the more easily it becomes for you to know when you've developed enough values and arrive at that balance between creating gray values or values with different colors and making sure that you are leaving a good amount of paper shining through so that you can easily portray white objects or subjects. All right, we're moving on to the very last pumpkin, and this one is going to be a light gray pumpkin, but it's gonna be more blue biased, meaning it's gonna be cooler. And I am going to be using two different colors for this one. I'm gonna be starting out with a gray created with indigo and burnt umber, which is gonna look cooler than the other gray that I used to paint in the white pumpkin. As both of these colors that I am using to create my gray are cooler in temperature in and of themselves than the warmer brown and the warmer blue that I was using previously for the white pumpkin. However, a lot of the same things still apply. If you have more blue than brown in your color mixture, your gray is going to look a little bit more like a grayish blue. And if you have more brown than blue in your color mixture, it's going to look like a grayish brown. So I am trying to go for an in-between for this one. You can see this swatched out right here. I'm gonna pull some out with just a little bit of water in my paintbrush so that you can see how it looks when it's watered down. I also prepare a little puddle of pure indigo on my color mixing palette because I'm gonna be dropping in some indigo on that initial layer of translucent gray. So just like with the previous pumpkin, we're going in with that gray initially. We're placing it in darkest value areas, and you want to make sure that your gray is very watered down. You can see how much water it contains in that top right well on my color mixing palette. My gray is pretty watered down, and even with this watered down gray, I make sure to drop it first into darker value areas, and once I feel I've placed enough gray on my paper, I remove that color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with just a little bit of water in my paintbrush and do my pulling of that same color into lighter value areas so that I can expand that gray and use that same amount of gray to cover up that larger portion. That's going to help you soften that gray and also create transitions into lighter value areas. I run my paintbrush over this entire light gray area a couple of times to ensure that this first layer of light gray is still going to be wet by the time I drop in my indigo into sections that I want to darken even further. For this last one, I'm not really trying to make it look like a white pumpkin, but more like a grayish bluish pumpkin. So I am not as careful as I was with the white one, but I'm still making sure that I'm not going in with way too much saturated color, and I am still making sure to do lifting whenever I feel I've placed way too much on there, because I do want it to look like a relatively light, cool gray. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like. feedback from me on your work, and much, much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things. So you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!